In 1942, Guadalcanal was a merciless green hill that swallowed flesh and blood, serving as the most terrifying meat grinder of the Pacific War. Here, the Empire of Jup and dispatched their proudest, ever victorious generals, leading their most elite troops in desperate, suicidal charges against the Reaper himself. Yet, this was no magnificent epic, it was a suffocating cycle of repetitive slaughter. In just a few short months, 3 top-tier Japanese commanders, each bringing their own massive armies, committed the exact same fatal mistake on the very same muddy battlefield, sending countless soldiers into the abyss of destruction as if cursed by an evil spell. Why would a colossal empire that had just swept through Singapore in 70 days, completely shattering the British defenders, become so foolish and blind on this island? What made them turn a blind eye to the mountains of fallen soldiers before them, marching toward annihilation time and time again? Let us open those top-secret files, intentionally locked away in cold storage for decades, to uncover the most incomprehensible strategic blind spot and sin of arrogance in the Pacific War, and see exactly how those generals, wrapped in layers of myth, failed so utterly in the mire of reality. Rewind to December 1941, a time when the Japanese Empire was at the absolute zenith of its unassailable power. Singapore, boasted by the British as an impenetrable fortress of the Far East, held out for a mere 70 days under the iron hooves of the Japanese army before completely falling. The photograph of British General Percival signing the surrendered document, with a look of profound despair, dominated the front page of every newspaper in Japan like the ultimate totem of victory, intensely stimulating the fanatical nerves of the entire nation. Amidst this near-manic joy of triumph, a dangerous dogma began to take root: the belief that Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spiritual willpower, could overcome any material force. This was no longer just an empty slogan meant to boost morale, it had mutated into an unshakable religious faith. Across Japan's military academies, this principle was elevated to the highest echelon of all tactical theories, repeatedly drilled into students by instructors during every lecture, solemnly written into every training manual, and treated as an absolute, rigorous, and unquestionable military law, much like the physics of ballistics. Carrying this fatal arrogance, the Japanese hiked and made a disastrous miscalculation of the American military's combat capabilities. In August 1942, an internal intelligence assessment report regarding the United States Marines on Guadalcanal circulated within the Japanese military. This was not propaganda meant to placate the public, but a genuine assessment that the military establishment believed with absolute certainty. The report, written with extreme disdain, described American soldiers as a bunch of spoiled playboys who severely lacked discipline, were completely incapable of coordinated night combat, and, most fatally, whose psychological defenses would collapse like wet paper the moment they faced direct and sustained firepower. Every Japanese officer who read this assessment believed it without a shadow of a doubt. As their eyes were filled with the phantoms of recent victories, the fall of the Philippines, the collapse of Wake Island, the humiliating Bataan Death March, all of this seemed to provide irrefutable evidence for their prejudice against the U.S. forces. In their eyes, the Americans were nothing more than lambs waiting to be slaughtered. During that exact same month, in Noumea, 400 miles south of Guadalcanal, U.S. Navy Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat at a makeshift metal desk fashioned from wooden planks, carefully reading an intelligence report that was practically identical in its contents. Only this report detailed the Japanese underestimation of American capabilities and the enemy's proud boast of their own night fighting superiority. Admiral Turner, his face grim, heavily underlined a specific section of the report with a pencil and decisively wrote 3 words in the margin: "We have not." Did not ostentatiously call for an emergency meeting, nor did he immediately issue a fleet-wide mobilization order. He simply uncalmly folded the report, locked it in the top drawer of his desk, and prepared himself. He knew that a brutal bloodbath was already inevitable. The wheels of history soon rolled to the dead of night on August 18th, 1942. 6 Japanese destroyers sped like ghosts under the cover of darkness, secretly delivering 917 soldiers from Japan's most elite units onto the shores of Taivu Point on Guadalcanal. The commander of this force was Colonel Kyo in Aichiki, a fanatical military man whose head had been completely turned by past victories. The landing was exceptionally smooth. The beach was dead silent with no firefights to speak of. In less than an hour, Colonel Aichiki efficiently assembled his troops on the sand, inspected their weapons and gear, and then led this lethal force into the dense, sweltering jungle. He left 100 men behind at Taivu Point as a rear guard, personally leading the remaining 800-plus soldiers in a frantic march westward along the winding coastline. Their ultimate target was the heart of the American presence 22 miles away, Henderson Field. Tucked intimately in the breast pocket of Colonel Aichiki's uniform was a personal diary. In this notebook, he had already arrogantly drafted a victory schedule for the next 3 days, as if this war were nothing but a rehearsed play. For August 20th, he noted that the troops would conduct a night march. For August 21st, his planned itinerary was simply enjoy the fruits of victory. As for August 22nd, the page was left completely blank. In Aichiki's view, the Americans were so incredibly weak that all combat would be conclusively wrapped up with a total Japanese victory before then, rendering any further planning entirely unnecessary. Even though his superiors had explicitly ordered him to secure a position and wait for a second echelon of troops to arrive before launching a general offensive, Aichiki completely ignored this directive. He was supremely confident, believing that based on his acute assessment of the battlefield, the Americans had already lost all their fighting spirit in previous naval defeats and were isolated and extremely weak. He firmly believed that no follow-up reinforcements were needed at all. A single fierce, autumn wind sweeping leaves-style night assault would be enough to make the defenses of Henderson Field crumble. Before his heroic Imperial soldiers, after marching barely 2 miles, Aichiki's forward scouts unexpectedly stumbled into a fierce firefight with an American patrol. It was a brief but deadly encounter, after which the American scouts, suffering some casualties, quickly withdrew. Upon receiving the battle report from the front, Colonel Aichiki did not heighten his guard. Instead, the skirmish only reinforced his judgment that the enemy was cowardly and prone to fleeing. He refused to let his troops rest for even a moment, driving them ever forward while broadcasting an incredibly arrogant radio message. Back to the base at Rabaul, no main enemy force discovered. The current advance feels as easy as marching across empty land. However, Kyo-Ao Aichiki was completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a snare meticulously laid by the Reaper that had successfully cracked the Japanese codes and achieved immortal merit at the Battle of Midway just months earlier. Had accurately intercepted and decrypted the top-secret signal. This intelligence not only contained his name but also explicitly detailed the movements of the 2nd Destroyer Squadron and pinpointed the fatal coordinates of Guadalcanal. This meant the Americans had a full 9 days to calmly prepare for this prey that was delivering itself right to them. On the ILU River defense line, the U.S. Marines had already received substantial troop reinforcements. Heavy weapons were strategically emplaced, and rows of dark muzzles were standing by, quietly waiting in the pitch black for the hunt to begin. When the vanguard triggered the hidden tripwires 2 miles from the core of the American lines, they foolishly assumed they had merely bumped into a random, minor American outpost. In reality, they had slammed into the outermost perimeter of an impregnable defensive position custom-built just for them. Even as the situation grew bizarrely intense, the leader remained deeply submerged in his self-woven illusion of inevitable victory after transmitting his wildly arrogant report. At 11:30 p.m., he did not hesitate to launch a do-or-die charge against the American front lines just before dawn. It was a suicidal assault that completely defied all military logic. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment. To suppress the American defenses, nor was there any detailed pre-battle reconnaissance to map out the enemy fields of fire. Relying on nothing but their fanatical Yamato Damashii iron-fixed bayonets, they charged headlong into the total darkness. Like moths to a roaring flame, Richard Tregg-Ask is a famous war correspondent who was deeply embedded with the U.S. Marines. On the front lines at the time, witnessed this battle up close and left a bone-chilling account in his personal notes. We heard them clearly long before we ever laid eyes on them. They were making a tremendous amount of noise in the dark, even shouting and screaming at the top of their lungs. These fanatical soldiers made absolutely no effort to hide themselves, conceal their approach. They genuinely believed their roaring screams alone would be enough to paralyze and terrify those undisciplined American playboys. They could not have been more wrong. The very instant they aggressively surged forward, American heavy machine guns positioned on the flanks roared to life simultaneously, instantly tearing the night sky to shreds with a crisscrossing net of tracer fire. The first wave of charging soldiers slammed blindly into the wire, into dense layers of American barbed wire. Under the torrential sweep of bullets, they were mowed down in massive droves. Like stalks of wheat, their broken bodies became horribly tangled in the cold steel, their blood turning the soil crimson. Immediately after, the second wave of soldiers, acting as if they were entirely brainwashed, marched right over the bodies, the still warm corpses of their comrades without a second hesitation, continuing their manic advance. Inevitably they fell. They too became nothing more than souls trapped on the wire, serving as meat shields for those behind them on the field. The commander, completely blinded by rage and denial, frantically sent in a third wave, but the same tragedy merely occurred, repeated itself without mercy. Human life was rendered utterly worthless here when the first rays of dawn finally appeared. Pierced the darkness of Guadalcanal the next morning, the curtain was only just falling on the massacre. General Vandegrift, American Commander General Vandegrift, gave the enemy no time to breathe. He decisively dispatched heavy tanks and infantry, and a full infantry battalion to push into the coconut grove on the east side with overwhelming force, conducting a sweep. A cold, methodical clearing of the battlefield in this slaughterhouse that resembled a literal hell on earth for everyone. 789 of the 917 elite soldiers brought ashore had been reduced to corpses. 2 cold, stiff corpses. In just 3 days, the transition from boundless ambition to total annihilation was truly complete. The 128 survivors could only lie terrified on the whites' ends, clinging to their last weak breaths. The so-called victory schedule had become a monumental, grotesque joke. Amidst infinite despair and disgrace, he burned it. A scene of profound absurdity unfolded. The operations officer, who had personally watched Colonel Aichiki march off to war, read the casualty report over and over again. His brain was clearly incapable of processing information that so violently contradicted his deepest beliefs. Eventually, he tossed the report onto his desk and, drowning in self-deception, declared, "I think this report is incorrect." In his twisted logic, the disaster was not only absurd but completely impossible. Simply because he firmly believed his troops were invincible and the Imperial Army could not possibly lose. These cold, bloody casualty figures absolutely had to be a telegraph operator's error. This systemic, top-to-bottom refusal to face reality guaranteed a cycle of tragedy. Faced with such a devastating defeat, the Haikum and did not pull back from the precipice or engage in profound soul-searching. Instead, acting exactly like a gambler who has lost his mind at the table, they blindly doubled their stakes. The Lieutenant General expression, Leslie summoned the next commander and once again rolled out the blood-stained map of Guadalcanal across his broad disk. This time, he sent another general along with a vastly larger army of 6,000 men. This should have been a vengeance mission born from deeply analyzed lessons. but sheer arrogance ensured they would tread the exact same path to ruin. Throughout the humid, sweltering days of late August and early September, the general spent 2 full weeks meticulously plotting what looked like a flawless campaign. On his maps, he planned a coordinated, thunderous, 3-pronged attack against the American-held Henderson Field from the south and east. Overflowing with confidence, he believed he would absolutely never repeat previous blunders. Yet, he fatally underestimated the terrifying power of Guadalcanal's primordial jungle. The island's jungle displayed its usual savage and unforgiving nature. The 3 massive columns of troops, clearly neatly demonstrated on paper, instantly lost all sense of direction the moment they stepped into the sun-blocking canopy. Precise formations were shredded by the merciless terrain. In an era devoid of advanced portable communication tech, coordination between units relied on the incredibly primitive method of runners using their own 2 legs. In a treacherous environment with no roads, no landmarks, and no reliable way to navigate, these messengers wandered like headless flies. The resulting delay was catastrophic. The various assault groups, meant to arrive at their jump-off points simultaneously, ended up arriving hours apart. A rapid march that was boldly promised to take 2 days devolved into 3 days of agonizing struggle through mud, disease, and total disorientation. Even so, the stubborn general recklessly ordered the advance to continue. He had formulated absolutely no contingency plans, meaning his massive offensive had to be hastily launched in a state of extreme chaos and exhaustion. On the moonless, overcast night of September 12th, the main force launched a massive, moth-to-a-flame charge up a steep ridge choked with waist-high kunai grass. At this location, later immortalized as Bloody Ridge, the American defensive line was actually dangerously thin, held by fewer than 800 exhausted Marine raiders and para-Marines. Against that narrow slope, the general frantically hurled nearly 3,000 men, all burning with the fanatical fire of Yamato Damashii. For to suffocating lie endless nights, the soldiers crashed against the high ground like waves of black water, due to the jungle's interference and total communication breakdown. Every wave arrived at the crest at different times and in disorganized formations, handing the Americans the perfect opportunity to defeat them piecemeal. The American line teetered on the brink of collapse under the frenzied biting and tearing of the assaults, but thanks to overwhelming firepower and an unbreakable will, it never completely shattered. Amidst the flying shrapnel and gore, a private first class fought like a possessed god of war. He gripped his heavy machine gun so tightly his knuckles turned white, the searing barrel practically melting, his ears filled with the roar of artillery and the screams of the enemy. In the utter chaos, he briefly thought the line had been breached and screamed, himself hoarse, calling for flanking fire support, while he personally continued to fight to the death, refusing to yield an inch until his weapon finally jammed, and the charging enemies before him had all been cut down, entirely engulfed by the shadow of death. The 6,000-strong army had once again smashed its head to pieces on this soil, fleeing. In a temporary staging camp, sitting under a dim, flickering light, the general composed a heavy-hearted document, an incredibly detailed after-action report. This time, there was no buck passing. He did not blame the terrain. He did not complain about the despair-inducing weather, and he certainly did not claim his men lacked the courage to charge. Conversely, and exceedingly rarely, he bluntly stated that the United States Marines exhibited skills, strict discipline, and an ironclad defensive willpower that vastly exceeded anyone's wildest imagination entirely, completely overturning the prejudiced predictions of military intelligence. In this profoundly grave document of historical introspection, the commander agonizingly penned a core conclusion: frontalist, alt is totally wrong. His analysis was sharp and profound, piercing straight to the heart of their tactical failures across the region. They had foolishly chosen the wrong angle of attack, forced their way through agonizingly incorrect terrain, and completely misjudged the situation, utilizing a force that was wholly insufficient to shatter prepared lines of American defenses. This was a blood-written plea that should have pulled the Empire back from the ledge. However, as this report, stained with the blood of frontline soldiers, was passed up the chain of command until it finally reached the lofty generals at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, history played a cruel joke. An unimaginably cruel joke. A reviewing general casually skimmed the pages, his eyes locked onto the words. Frontal assault. He picked up a pen, drew a heavy, dismissive line under those two words as if it were the only takeaway, and then committed an act that borders on the criminal. He shoved this priceless, post-battle analysis into an obscure filing cabinet and locked it away, treating it like absolute trash. Just like that, the truth was buried alive. Even the Supreme Commander who was about to personally lead the next expedition was permanently robbed of the chance to read a weeping report that could have altered the entire trajectory of the campaign and saved tens of thousands of lives. The arrogance of the Highcom, it had become a term in a illness. For the third attempt, the Lieutenant General decided to stop delegating. He took the field himself, bringing an enormous force of 20,000 elite troops, powerful heavy artillery, and, in an act of breathtaking absurdity, a dedicated staff team whose sole purpose was to organize the impending American surrender ceremony. He marched onto Guadalcanal with total conviction, believing that with enough manpower, the spirit could crush anything in its path. Yet, the merciless wheel of history ground his hubris to dust. Despite the massive surge in numbers, he utilized the exact same tactical blueprint as his two predecessors hacked through the man-eating jungle and launch a frontalist ult. Even more laughably, because the jungle was so impenetrable, he ended up abandoning all. The heavy artillery, the very weapons meant to provide crucial perceived, is fired deep within the thickets. The Grand Offensive, originally scheduled for October 23rd, was fatally delayed to the 24th. Because his troops were entirely exhausted and lost in the wilderness. During this lethal delay, the Americans calmly neutralized isolated tank threats and reinforced their defensive perimeter until it was solid as an iron barrel. When the general assault finally began, the soldiers, who had just survived a brutal 15-mile trek through the jungle, were already reduced to walking skeletons by starvation and rampant malaria, dragging their diseased, weakened bodies. They hurled themselves once more against machine gun nests, spitting unyielding fire. The outcome held zero suspense. The general was greeted with an annihilation far more pathetic, far more absolute, and far more blood-soaked than the two before him. Guadalcanal had officially become the grand graveyard of the army. 3 colossal, strategically vital battles, 3 battle-hardened, arrogant generals, yet not a single person dared to stand up in any official strategy meeting and ask the simplest, most fundamental, and most vital common sense question. It was not because they lacked military intellect or intelligence. It was because, deep within their souls, they were absolutely terrified of the answer. Because if that answer were ever brought into the light, it would act as a devastating bomb, completely obliterating the foundational cornerstone upon which they and the entire Japanese militarist system had built their fanatical faith. They didn't dare to ask, did Colonel Ichiki actually have enough men to begin with? They would rather die than admit that the so-called Yamato Damashii I worshipped as an infallible god was rendered utterly pale, weak, and pathetic when brought face to face with the overwhelming steel abundant munitions and equally unyielding, if not stronger, combat resolve of the American military forces to protect a hollow illusion. They willingly closed their eyes, watching silently as tens of thousands of young, vibrant lives were shoveled into an endless, unfillable black hole of war. This is a blood-soaked lesson in arrogance, prejudice, and blind. Obedience to dogma. War is not a child's game, nor is it a script that can be won with loud slogans alone. Just like decades later, a lucky Japanese grandfather who survived the catastrophic meat grinder would freeze whenever the word Guadalcanal was spoken in times of peace. His normally gentle face would lock into a suffocating, prolonged silence, because only he knew that the truths buried forever in the depths of that pitch-black jungle and the wailing of his fallen comrades were far colder than American bullets, piercing the souls of the living with an agony that would never fade, and all of it, every last drop of blood, should never have happened. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, as deadliest miscalculations, please smash that like button and subscribe. I am your dedicated strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.